November 29, 1943. The sky over northern Germany was the color of cold steel, and inside the cramped tail of a B-17 Flying Fortress, a 19-year-old gunner pressed his eyes to the plexiglass and watched death assemble itself behind him. His name was Eugene Moran, a farm boy from the back roads of Wisconsin, and this was the first time he had ever flown into combat over enemy soil. Within the next hour, everything he understood about survival would be torn apart, until nothing remained but instinct, pain, and the empty sky rushing up to meet him. The bomber carried a name on her nose. The crew called her Ricky Tick Tavi. That morning she was one of more than 300 heavy bombers thundering toward Bremen, one of the most savagely defended industrial cities in the entire Reich. Down below sat the shipyards, the aircraft factories, the submarine pens, the beating heart of the German war machine. And the Germans knew exactly what was coming for it. Moran sat alone at the very rear of the aircraft, perched on a thin bicycle-style seat with nearly 40 feet of hollow aluminum separating him from the rest of his crew. No one could reach him. No one could see him. His entire world shrank down to a single sheet of glass, a steel plate bolted behind his spine, and twin 50-caliber machine guns aimed into the void. The tail was the most isolated place on any bomber ever built, and the German fighter pilots knew that better than anyone. His job was simple to describe and brutal to carry out. Defend the one approach no other gun could fully cover. Everything behind the bomber belonged to him, and if he failed, there was no second line of defense. The men in the nose, the men in the waist, the man in the ball turret beneath the belly, every one of them was counting on the boy in the tail to keep the killers off their backs. They had learned the lesson early in the war. If you attacked a flying fortress from directly behind, you stripped away its greatest strength. No overlapping fields of fire, no crossfire from a dozen guns, just one lonely man standing between you and the bomber's controls. By late 1943, that single tactic was slaughtering American crews at a horrifying rate. The fortress carried 10 men, and every one of them had a job that could end his life in a heartbeat. The pilot and co-pilot wrestled the controls up front. The navigator and bombardier worked in the glass nose. The engineer manned the top turret. The radio operator sat behind the bomb bay. 2 waist gunners stood at open windows in the freezing slipstream, and 1 man was sealed into the ball turret hanging beneath the belly. And then there was Moran, alone in the tail, cut off from all of them by 40 feet of empty fuselage. The numbers were almost too cruel to believe. A crew needed 25 completed missions to go home. The average crew never made it past 15. Entire squadrons watched half their aircraft vanish in a single month. Just 2 months earlier, a single deep raid had cost 600 men in one afternoon, killed or captured before the sun went down. The men flew them anyway, and they gave these missions a grim nickname, whispered between prayers: "The milk runs to hell." Moran had enlisted the day he turned 18. He had grown up milking cows on a dairy farm near a tiny place called Soldiers' Grove, staring up at the aircraft passing overhead and dreaming of a life beyond fences and fields. He wanted to fly. The army had other plans. They needed gunners, young men with sharp eyes and steady hands, and the stomach to shoot at something shooting back. Farm boys fit that description perfectly. Training taught him the cold mathematics of aerial gunnery, how to lead a target screaming past at hundreds of miles an hour, how to correct for wind and altitude and his own speed all at once, how to fire in short controlled bursts so his barrels would not melt, how to identify an enemy fighter from 2,000 yards, a Messerschmitt from a Focke-Wulf, friend from killer. He learned all of it, and none of it could prepare a human being for what waited above Germany. At 24,000 feet, the temperature plunged to 40 degrees below zero. The air was so thin that lifting an arm left a man gasping. Oxygen masks froze solid against frozen faces. Frostbite ate fingers and toes before the enemy ever appeared, and when the enemy did appear, they came in waves, hammering the bombers with 20-millimeter cannon shells that punched through aluminum like it was wet paper. Ricky Tick Tavi lifted off from an airfield in England that morning inside a tight formation, every bomber locked into a defensive box, so each aircraft could shield the others with interlocking guns. On paper, it was brilliant. In the air, it was something else, because a single burst of fire could shred two bombers, flying wingtip to wingtip in the same heartbeat. As Bremen rose into view, the German anti-aircraft batteries opened up. The sky filled with black bursts of flak, so thick the men swore you could climb out and walk across them. There was no dodging. During the bombing run, a fortress had to hold straight and level, steady as a target on a range, while jagged steel ripped through her wings and belly. Moran watched a bomber just ahead take a direct hit and fold almost in half before tumbling away into a long smear of smoke. Then, Rikki-Tiktavi dropped her load. 4,000 pounds of bombs fell toward the factories below, and the mission was, on paper, a success. But success meant nothing now. Now came the part that killed men. Now they had to get home, 200 miles of hostile air standing between them and England. The formation banked west, and that was the exact moment a burst of flak slammed into the No. 2 engine on Moran's bomber. The propeller spun uselessly in the wind. The aircraft slowed. And slowly, terribly, Rikki-Tiktavi began to drift behind the protective wall of guns around her. Every man aboard understood what that meant. A wounded bomber that fell out of formation almost never came home. German fighters hunted stragglers the way wolves hunt the limping animal at the back of the herd, and a lone flying fortress, stripped of the formation's massed firepower, was simply a death sentence waiting for the paperwork to catch up. From his glass cocoon at the tail, Moran saw them gathering. Fighters climbing up from below, others rolling in from above, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs sliding into position with the calm of men who had done this many times before. He counted them through the freezing glass, and felt his mouth go dry. There were too many. Rikki-Tiktavi was about to fight completely alone, 200 miles from any safety, with one engine dead and a sky full of hunters closing in. And the first target those hunters would reach was the boy in the tail. The first attack came straight up the spine of the bomber, the fighters rising out of the blind spot beneath the tail like sharks lifting from deep water. Moran saw the dark shapes swelling in his plexiglass and jammed his shoulders back against the steel plate. There was nowhere to dodge, there was nowhere to hide. So he did the only thing left to do. He squeezed both triggers, and the twin 50s roared to life, the recoil slamming through his whole body as tracer fire tore into the air behind them. The lead German broke off at the last possible instant, rolling hard to escape the stream of fire. But that was only the opening move of a game these pilots had rehearsed 100 times. The next fighters came in immediately, not in a wild rush but in coordinated pairs. One aircraft would slash across the tail at an angle to draw his fire, while its partner lined up from another direction, waiting for the exact second his guns swung away. Moran swung the barrels from one threat to the next, firing in short, disciplined bursts, fighting the enemy and the savage limits of his own cramped position at the same time. Spent brass cascaded around his boots, clattering against the metal floor and piling up against his knees. The stink of burnt powder filled the tiny compartment. His breath crystallized against the rubber of his mask, every inhale scorching his lungs, every exhale fogging his vision for a fraction of a second that could be his last. Outside the glass, the Luftwaffe pilots flew with the confidence of professionals. These were not frightened rookies. These were men who knew precisely how to take a flying fortress apart, bolt by bolt. They went for the engines first, knowing a crippled bomber could never rejoin the formation. Then they worked their way inward, silencing each defensive gun one at a time. Moran heard the hits before he felt them, the hollow thudding and shrieking of cannon shells ripping through the fuselage somewhere up ahead. One waste gun fell silent. Then the other. The intercom dissolved into static and broken, half-shouted words. He had no idea who was still alive up front. He had no time to wonder. A Focke-Wulf crossed his sights at close range, and he let it on pure instinct and fired. The fighter's wing erupted, fragments peeling away as it rolled over and dropped, trailing smoke toward the earth. His first confirmed kill. He felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, only the cold certainty that the next attack was already on its way. It was the silences that frightened him most. The seconds between attacks felt somehow worse than the gunfire itself. Moran learned fast that the Germans never charged blindly. They circled just beyond his reach, engines throttled back, watching him, measuring him, learning the rhythm of his guns. During those pauses, he forced himself to stop firing, not out of mercy but out of brutal discipline, because an overheated barrel meant a jam, and a jam meant death. His eyes never stopped moving, sweeping the sky behind the bomber for the faintest shift of light that might betray an approaching fighter. The cold was already winning its own quiet battle. It had worked through his gloves, and his fingers answered slower now, stiff and clumsy, forcing him to think through motions that had once been automatic. He flexed them between attacks, terrified of losing all feeling. Somewhere forward, another gun cut out mid-burst. He felt it more than heard it. One less weapon, one less man. The bomber's protection was crumbling away piece by piece, and somehow he understood that every second he stayed alive was forcing the Germans to pay a price they would soon decide was too high. They came back tighter now, faster, hungrier. They had seen the formation vanish over the horizon. They knew this bomber was utterly alone. Moran recognized the pattern instantly. They were probing him, testing his angles, trying to make him commit his guns in one direction so they could strike from another. So he forced himself to slow down. He fired only when the lead was perfect, only when the distance collapsed into something he could not miss. His tracers stitched precise lines across the sky instead of wild, desperate sprays. A Messerschmitt flashed through his sights too fast to catch cleanly, and he let it go. Another followed half a second behind, climbing through the same patch of air, and this one he caught, watching his rounds tear through its fuselage until it shuddered and fell away. He did not look to see if it crashed. There was no time to look. The pauses between attacks were shrinking now, the Germans compressing the fight, stealing his recovery time, deliberately grinding him down with exhaustion. He felt the bomber changing beneath him. More damage was piling up, not catastrophic yet, but wrong. Those subtle shifts in vibration you only notice when something deep inside the machine is already breaking. He tasted blood in his mouth and could not tell if it came from a wound or from clenching his jaw so hard it ached. The mask dragged at his face as the aircraft bucked through another near miss, and in that moment a cold clarity settled over him. He was no longer defending the bomber, he was only delaying its death, and delay, he realized, was the only kind of victory he had left. Then the cannon fire found the tail itself. Something smashed into his left arm with crushing force. A heartbeat, later another round, tore into his right. Pain exploded white-hot through his body, and blood soaked dark into both sleeves, but somehow his hands still closed around the triggers. He could still shoot. So, he kept shooting. The whole tail section shuddered violently as control cables snapped overhead and whipped through the compartment like steel serpents. Hit after hit hammered into the vertical fin, each impact shaking the structure around him. Out of pure reflex he glanced down at his parachute, and the truth hit him harder than any cannon shell. The canvas was shredded, riddled with holes punched clean through by gunfire, the silk inside torn to ribbons. The parachute was dead. If this aircraft came apart in the sky, there would be no escape, no second chance. Only open air, and gravity, and 4 miles of nothing between him and the ground. At least 15 German fighters now circled the dying bomber, taking turns to dive in, strike, and peel away. Ricky Tiktavi was bleeding altitude with every second, her surviving engines straining and shaking under a load they were never built to carry, and forward of the tail, only one other man was still alive. The navigator, wounded, but conscious in the nose. Everyone else was gone. The pilot, the co-pilot, the engineer, the radio operator, the ball turret gunner, both waist gunners. 8 men dead, 2 still breathing, and 40 feet of shattered fuselage stretched out between them. Then another shell struck something vital deep in the airframe. Moran felt it before the sound reached him, a sickening lurch followed by a grinding vibration that rattled his teeth. And then the entire aircraft began to scream. Structure that had held for thousands of miles finally surrendered, the shriek of a machine tearing itself apart under forces it was never meant to endure. And then the world simply split in two. The fuselage sheared apart just forward of the tail. Moran watched the rest of the bomber fall away, the wings and engines tumbling into empty space and carrying what was left of his crew with them. The tail pitched over hard, torn completely free, and spun off into the void. He was alone now in a fragment of an aircraft, both arms wounded, his parachute destroyed, falling from 24,000 feet over enemy territory. And physics is not a thing you can argue with. A falling body tops out around 120 miles an hour, and the severed tail weighed several thousand pounds. By every law of nature ever written, Eugene Moran had perhaps 90 seconds left to live. The broken tail dropped into a violent spin almost the instant it tore free. The rotation was savage and disorienting, ripping away any sense of which way was up. Up became sideways. Down disappeared entirely. Moran was hurled against the interior walls as the wreckage cartwheeled through open air, his shattered arms burning with blinding pain every time his body slammed into the structure. He clamped his jaw shut and forced himself to breathe in shallow sips, fighting the instinct to gasp, because panic would burn through his oxygen and steal the few seconds he had left. He knew no human being could survive a fall like this, not without a parachute, not without control. And he had neither. And yet the tail did not simply drop like a stone. The vertical and horizontal fins bit into the rushing air, twisting raw gravity into something uneven and unpredictable. The spin began to slow, not stopping, but stretching out, dragging the descent into something almost, impossibly, survivable, and Moran felt the change not as relief but as a new kind of terror, because a longer fall meant more time to feel the bones grinding in his arms, more time to understand exactly what was waiting at the bottom. The German fighters had not all broken away. Some circled the falling tail, uncertain, simply watching. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this. A tail gunner still alive inside a falling fragment of a bomber. His arms were shattered, his parachute gone, his aircraft gone, but his machine guns were still bolted in place, still loaded, still working. So he reached for the grips again, ignoring the white-hot agony tearing through both ruined arms, wrapped his fingers around the triggers, and fired. Tracer rounds spat into the sky in wild spinning arcs as the tail rotated. The German pilots scattered on instinct. One Messerschmitt drifted too close, and his rounds stitched across its fuselage. The fighter rolled away, trailing smoke. Then, the broken fins did something no one could have predicted. They caught the air. Drag built up unevenly across the torn surfaces. The wreckage stopped tumbling end over end and settled into a rough, sliding descent. Not controlled, not safe, but slower, far slower than free fall. The ruined tail had become a crude, accidental wing. It clipped the top of a pine tree first, then cartwheeled down through the canopy, smashing into one tree after another. Moran's head slammed into the framework, and his vision exploded into white light. He felt his ribs crack, and then the tail struck the frozen ground, and everything stopped. Silence. No engines, no wind, no gunfire, just a high ringing in his ears and the ragged sound of his own breathing. Eugene Moran was alive. Barely, both forearms were shattered into compound fractures, the bone pushing through torn skin. His ribs were broken. Blood poured down his face from a head wound, where part of his skull had been torn clean away. He had fallen 4 miles out of the sky without a parachute, and he was still breathing. One of only a tiny handful of human beings in all of history ever to do such a thing. He dragged himself, inch by agonizing inch, out onto the frozen ground, and that was when he heard German voices moving through the trees. He could not fight. He lay still as armed soldiers stepped out of the forest and surrounded the wreckage. They loaded him onto a wooden cart and hauled him away, discarding him on a concrete floor as though already dead. 2 days passed. Infection set in. His arms turned dark. The German doctors took one look and turned away. Beyond saving, but 2 men did not turn away. They were Serbian doctors, prisoners themselves, and they decided to act, not because anyone ordered them to, but because they were physicians. They operated for 7 hours with crude tools and almost no anesthesia, setting his bones with wire and pins and fixing a metal plate over the wound in his skull. The fever came that night and nearly killed him, but on the third morning it broke, and Eugene Moran opened his eyes, still alive. What followed was 17 months of captivity. Barbed wire and guard towers, thin soup and black bread, cattle cars and disease, and finally, as the war closed in, a forced march west through the snow, where anyone who fell behind was shot. Men died every day on that road. But Moran kept walking. He had survived a 4-mile fall out of the sky, and he was not going to die in a ditch. On April 26th, American troops finally reached the column and the guards surrendered. Eugene Moran weighed 93 pounds. He was free. So let me leave you with this. The tail of a bomber was the loneliest and most exposed place in the entire sky, where one man stood alone against everything the enemy could throw at him. On that freezing morning in 1943, a 19-year-old farm boy from Wisconsin sat in that seat. And when the cockpit was destroyed, his crew was gone, and his parachute was shredded to ribbons, he did not surrender to gravity, to fear, or to certain death. He kept firing, all the way down from 24,000 feet. The Army later confirmed that only 3 men in the entire war survived falls like his. He came home to Wisconsin, married, worked, and rarely spoke of what he had endured. Eugene Moran died in 2014 at the age of 89, a man who fought physics itself and lived to tell the world about it.